So that then, okay, that makes me think about, I feel that I've seen the New York food scene for the Indian food scene in New York change a lot in the last 5 to 6 years. I don't know if you agree with me, because restaurants like Dhamaka and Sema have wait lists that were unheard of for Indian restaurants. Earlier you just had your Lexington curry houses. You had a tabla, but it was, food presented very differently, Indian food. But this is authentic Indian food in that sense. And now the other thing I've noticed is, and just being upscale doesn't seem to matter. Restaurants like Sona, etc., shut down. It really has to offer something. The second thing I notice is that regional cuisines are starting to come out. They're getting away from the standard expectation of what an Indian restaurant ought to serve. So you have masala wala with the Bengali food. All of them is impossible to get into. And suddenly all the other Michelin star famous restaurants seem to think that the New York scene has changed, and there's Musafir that's opened up because it's a Michelin star from Houston. There's Ambassador Club that's come in from London, and so on. So what do you think is changing in terms of hard or soft power? Like, how is New York,
Yeah.
what is New York reacting to?
Your assessment is
Yeah.
absolutely correct. In some ways, some Indian restaurants are entering the upscale market, but also one has to keep in mind the sense of proportion. There are about 300 Indian restaurants in New York City, out of which I would say about 20 are upscale. That gives you a percentage range, right? Very different, by the way, from French. Almost half the French restaurants in
There
New
it
York
was.
City are upscale. So that's the context. But you're absolutely right. The Indian high-end Indian restaurant cuisine is becoming more visible, and it's becoming more visible for a couple of simple reasons. There is now very affluent and culturally fluent Indian migrants,
Yeah.
and people like me included, in some ways we're professors, of course, physicians and engineers, and it has acquired cultural capital. It is linked to the rise of an Indian middle class,
Mhm.
a professional class. I think it's inappropriate to call it middle class. It's in fact higher class. It's circulating around the world, major cities, and they want a place where they can bring their friends, their Indian friends, their American friends, and you see that enthusiasm in New York City, any major marketplace. So it's partly linked to the changing nature of Indian migration, and which basically since 1965 has been a substantially kind of an educated, almost 70% of Indian immigrants have at least a bachelor's degree, which is very unusual for any immigrant group. And it has some of the highest per capita household income, just like with, for instance, Taiwanese American and Indian American and Japanese American are up there. And which part it is that demographic change that is driving it. That's one direction.
Yeah.
But in the demand direction, something has changed, where sociologists say that Americans, at least since the 1980s, have become a lot more omnivorous. And they noticed it first, sociologists noticed it first in music. That if you correlate your assets and your income and your education, you are more likely to listen to jazz and country and pop and rock. And if your assets in some ways are in the bottom 20%, if your income is in the bottom 20% and your education is in the bottom 20%, you tend to be a univore. You only listen to hip hop, or you only listen to country music. So, what was noticed since the 1980s is that the American elite consumer had become much more omnivorous, which was considered different from old-fashioned snobbery.
Mhm.
Snobbery was disdain, and you said, "Nah, I didn't want to. I don't want to listen to hip hop. I don't want to listen to jazz because that's inferior. I don't want to eat Indian food because it's not haute cuisine." That is no longer cool or kosher in any of the urban cultures. So now you say, I eat Indian food and I eat Mexican food and I eat Korean food and I eat French food and I eat Italian food. And these are the conditions on which I think the good qualities of a cuisine. So the demographic has changed in terms of Indians on one side, and the American consumers' omnivorousness has changed. And you can see that in the Michelin data, in the New York Times data, which I track. The number of cuisines have gone up to, it used to be 7, 8 kind of cuisines. You had Italian, you had Mexican, you had Seoul, you had Indian, etc. Today, in some ways, global Michelin, New York Times, it's almost 40, 45 different kinds of cuisines register in your top 50 or top 100.